Hello and welcome to What America's Thinking, where we discuss key elections, demographic trends, and public opinion. I'm Rafael Bernal.
And I'm Julia Manchester. It's been 3 years since the coronavirus pandemic rocked the world. And though the origin of COVID-19 continues to be the subject of much debate, this past week, an article in the Wall Street Journal revealed the United States Energy Department concluded it most likely came from a lab leak. We don't know more details because that DOE report hasn't been made public.
Now, officials have downplayed that revelation, saying the agency made its assessment with low confidence. But FBI Director Christopher Wray more or less confirmed the suspicion that it was born in a lab. Let's watch.
The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan.
So Wray refrained from giving details for security reasons, but he added this.
I will just make the observation that the Chinese government, seems to me, has been doing its best to try to thwart and obfuscate the work here, the work that we're doing, the work that our U.S. government and close foreign partners are doing, and that's unfortunate for everybody.
Regardless of where COVID actually came from, polling shows that about half of Americans believe a Wuhan lab leak caused it. According to a Morning Consult survey released just days before the DOE's assessment, 46% of respondents say they think COVID spilled over from a lab. 26% think it jumped from animals to humans naturally.
Morning Consult broke the poll down further by party affiliation, and a closer look shows that those who identify as Republicans overwhelmingly believe the lab leak theory, 70% to be exact, compared to 32% of Democrats who feel the same way. Rafael, this is deja vu coming on the 3-year anniversary of the coronavirus pandemic. And, for years we've been debating, officials, media personalities, medical experts have been debating where this lab came from, or the virus originated from. But it's not lost on me or on many of us, that these findings are coming as U.S. relations with China hit an all-time low with the Chinese spy balloon, of course, their involvement in the war in Ukraine and supporting Russia. How do you think U.S. attitudes towards the Chinese government are impacting some of these polls, particularly among Republicans?
So that's a really important question. I do think among Republicans, so let's look at the two extremes of the spectrum of beliefs on the origin of COVID-19, or the virus that caused COVID-19. On one side, on the, let's call it the reactionary side, you have people who say that anybody who suggests that it didn't come from a lab is basically in cahoots with the Chinese Communist Party. On the way other end of the spectrum, you have people who say that any suggestion that it did come from a lab is rooted in anti-Asian bigotry.
Yeah.
So what I think this poll tells us more than anything is where Americans lie mostly in the middle of these two very extreme, very incompatible positions. And I do think that relations with China, as you mentioned, have fueled a little bit more movement toward the right side, toward the knowing, quote unquote, knowing that it came from a lab. But
yeah.
How do you read this poll? Because we are polling an unknowable, right? Mm-hmm. The FBI has moderate confidence. Apparently, the Department of Energy has low confidence. Mm-hmm. But there's also intelligence community groups that have low confidence that it didn't come from a lab. It's split. The knowledge of this is split. We don't know. How does this knowledge gap affect, is it just politics?
Yeah, what's been fascinating is watching how different partisan media outlets have been covering this. I mean, those on the more left-leaning side of the media spectrum have been, making those critiques and those observations, like you mentioned, the suggestion that it could have come from China originally. There could be some root in anti-Asian sentiment, which, unfortunately has skyrocketed. Prior to the coronavirus pandemic, but especially during the pandemic, very unfairly, very unjustly. But at the same time, though, on more right-leaning networks, you have this theory really being pushed. And, there's this sort of, look, we told you so attitude coming from a lot more right-leaning conservative commentators. So, I think, fortunately, unfortunately, I don't know. I think it's kind of a state of affairs here in the United States. The American people are getting their news and their opinions on this based on what they watch. And I think that's really playing a role in this. I thought it was interesting that Chris Wray, the FBI director, Christopher Wray, gave an interview to someone like Bret Baier of Fox News, obviously a very respected journalist at Fox News, but Fox News appeals to a more right-leaning audience. So I think putting the FBI director out in front of that audience and someone like Bret Baier, who has appeal, I would say, to both sides of the aisle, was an interesting move from the FBI, to appeal to a broader audience as a whole.
Yeah, and Ray was saying things that largely, and we can say that now looking at this poll, but largely the Fox News audience wants to hear. That confirms their beliefs. And these beliefs are rooted in, I keep coming back to the unknowable, and what you just said about what it says about our current political condition, that people are fighting, people are really taking it personally. A lot of people take it personally that their opinion on an unknowable is challenged. So, yeah. I mean, what do you think is, how do we get out of this one?
It's really unclear. I think you're still going to see other theories floated because I think there still is some debate in the intelligence community as to where this came from, where this virus originated from. So, and I think there's debate among Americans. So I think this is going to be something that's going to be debated for years to come. And a lot of it's going to be confirmation bias from where they're getting their news and information from. But I thought it was very important that Christopher Wray came out and made those comments to a journalist so he could essentially, very much set the record straight in many ways. I mean, we don't know all that he knows. We don't know all that the Department of Energy knows, but this was very much his way of communicating this to the American people.
Strongest official statement so far.
Yeah, absolutely. And President Biden inherited the coronavirus crisis, and he earns higher marks for his handling of the pandemic than other issues like skyrocketing inflation and foreign affairs.
A Gallup poll published this week shows that while his overall job approval rating is still hovers at 42% and approval for his handling of the economy at 34%, 53% of respondents like the job he has done when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now that strict measures to prevent the spread of the COVID are ending, and as government initiatives like providing at-home testing kits, free government-funded vaccines, the question is, will Biden be able to keep touting his record on COVID, which, it seems to be his strongest issue in the polls? Will he?
That's a good question. And I have the same question about the other side of the aisle with someone like Ron DeSantis, who took a huge risk in his handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Ultimately, when it comes to, Florida's economy and more people moving to Florida because it was touted as the free state of Florida, it worked out well for Ron DeSantis. But in a general election, and Biden, does seem on track to run for re-election in 2024, voters have short memories. And obviously the coronavirus is a huge issue and it's impacted all of our lives. But are voters going to be going to the ballot box and making their decision based on how the coronavirus was handled by Donald Trump or Joe Biden? Or are they going to be looking at the issues that are here and now? I think there's definitely an argument to be made that the coronavirus has contributed to a lot of the issues that we're facing now, like inflation, for example, like a lot of the socioeconomic changes we've seen throughout the United States, contributing to crime, for example, maybe, or higher rates of crime. So I think you're going to see that issue play out on the campaign trail, but they're going to have to message it so it's more forward-looking. So Joe Biden, look, I would be curious to say if Joe Biden would use his leadership during the coronavirus pandemic to say, look, this is what I did. And I think you could see Donald Trump do the same thing. I think both administrations did have, can fairly take credit for Operation Warp Speed. There were, it was definitely a dual effort, and I know that Democrats and Republicans don't like to admit it, but it was.
Sometimes the deep state is actually doing, the so-called deep state is actually doing a lot of the job. But I think that the part that you said that Americans, well, not Americans, voters worldwide really have short memories. I think that's important. I don't think that's a flaw in voters. I think that is, people tend to vote on the issues that are most important to them. And clearly, COVID has been a hugely important issue. It was in the 2020 election cycle, in the 2022 election cycle, in states like Virginia, and in their own 21 election cycle. And I wonder if, and I don't think this is knowable right now, but if this issue will stretch out into the 24 election cycle. Will voters in November of next year be still thinking about the things we're thinking about right now as this policy goes away? I don't know, but I think the White House hopes they are.
Yeah, well, before May and June of 2022, we certainly weren't talking about abortion access the same way we were after Roe v. Wade was overturned. And that threw a huge wrench into the midterms and impacted races up and down the ballot. And coming up, we'll dig into new polling on the 2024 GOP primary from WPA Intelligence.